Alright, so where we left off, we had implemented jump, but there is nothing stopping the player from jumping forever. So we need to figure out how to detect when the player's on the ground and only allow the player to jump when they're on the ground. So we're gonna do this by going back to our player character script here, and we're gonna use a thing called a ContactFilter2D. There's a few different ways we could detect ground, but the ContactFilter2D kind of gives us the most uh, options and control over how we're going to do it. So we'll just practice that. So I think an easy way to set this up is to make another serialized field, and it will be private. ContactFilter2D is the type of the variable we're going to make, and we can just name it, we'll name it something that indicates this is what we're going to use to filter out ground. So we'll call it ground contact filter. That looks good. So if we were to save this and go back to the Unity editor, and select our player character, you should see that a new field has appeared. And this one actually has its own collapsible section. So the ground contact filter has a whole bunch of choices, and we'll make more sense of them in a minute. So the next thing I want to do, we've got this ground contact filter, but we need to sort of visualize an area below the player that we're going to look at to consider whether or not there's any ground in there. Um, so I'm going to add another component to the player character game object. And this is going to be physics 2D circle collider 2D. And basically we're going to use this circle as a representation of where we're going to look for ground. And if there's any ground inside of the circle, then we'll say, yeah, the player's standing on ground. So find the circle collider, and we're going to want to offset it on the Y. So I'm just going to drag it down until it is a little bit lower. So that's kind of gives us a little bit of area underneath the player to check for ground. And I'm going to reduce its radius somewhat because I definitely don't want this green circle to be sticking out past the player's hitbox, because otherwise we'll detect ground that's actually like a wall. We only want to check for ground below the player. So in other words, if we had this radius too big like this, we'd be detecting ground like above the player, to the left and right of the player. That's not what we want. So we need to make sure that the radius is smaller than the outer collision of the player. And if we were to just to run the game now, the player would like be landing on this kind of invisible round thing. And that's not what I want. I don't want this circle collider to actually have hard, solid collision. I just want it to detect if there's anything in it. I don't want it to actually bounce off of anything. And that's what the is trigger checkbox does. So if we mark this as a trigger, it will no longer actually physically collide with walls, but it will still detect when it's touching things. And that's exactly what I need it to do. So make sure you mark the circle collider as is trigger. And so if we hit play now, it should still fall flush with the floor, just like it was previously. But if we were to look at the scene view, you can see we do have this green circle down there. And so if we were properly checking to see if the circle is touching ground, our character would know it was on the ground right now. Alright, so if you check out the contact filter, it has this thing called a layer mask. And the layer mask is going to allow us to select what counts as ground. And so we could just count everything as ground, but that's going to be problematic if we ever have, like, for example, the player itself, that would be counted as ground. And so this circle would detect that it's touching the player's collider, and we would always think we're on the ground. So that doesn't make any sense. And what if we had surfaces that we don't want to count as ground, like ceilings or water or spikes or things like that, right? Stuff the player could presumably be above and this collider could touch, but we don't want to count as ground. So what we need to do is make a new layer that we can just call ground, and then assign all the ground objects to that layer. So what I'll do is go to Edit, Project Settings, Tags and Layers, and we will expand Layers. And in the first choice we're allowed to customize here, number 8, we'll make a new layer called Ground. And now that I've made this new layer, I can go select our floors. I have 3 floors, so I'm just going to hold Control and select each of them. So I have all 3 floors selected, and I'm going to move them onto the ground layer. So now these are on that ground layer, and if I go back to my player and I find the contact filter, I'm going to update this layer mask so that it's looking for the ground layer. So we're filtering out things that aren't on the ground layer. We're only going to be concerned with ground. And the other thing we want to do here is, since what we're going to use to detect the ground is this circle collider that we marked as a trigger, actually that's not right. We can leave the rest of these settings just how they are. Except we do need to make sure we tell the contact filter that we want it to use this layer mask. So just make sure you check use layer mask. I almost said check use triggers, but that would make our ground detect include things that are triggers, and we don't want to count triggers as ground, only hard collision. Okay. So now let's go back to our player character script, and we know that we can safely use this ground contact filter when we get to that point because we've defined it in the editor. And let's make a Boolean variable that will determine whether or not the player is on the ground. Or it won't determine that, it will be used to store whether or not the player is on the ground. So we'll check if the player is on the ground, and we'll set this Boolean based on whether the player is on the ground. So we'll say private bool is on ground. All right. And then remember, we want to kind of keep our update functions nice and clean. So this one is a good example. It just says move in here. I don't need to examine all of this code to figure out what it does. I can just read the name of it and understand that it's for moving. On the other hand, this one is starting to get a little bogged down. So maybe we should refactor some of this. Let's refactor this one. And so I'll select these lines and hit Control period, and then hit enter to extract the method, and we will name this method handle jump input, because that's what we're doing. We're checking for the input, and then we're actually handling the input. If they press jump, we're going to go ahead and make them jump. So then you just hit enter and it will actually rename this method for us. So we just took all that code that used to be in update and put it in its own function called handle jump input. And then here, this is just one line, but I'm going to go ahead and rename it anyhow and put it in its own function just to keep things extra clear. So I'll select this, I will hit Control period, and then I'll hit enter, and I'll name this update horizontal input, because that's what's happening there. So this is a little easier to read, and now I'm free to start adding more stuff in here without getting confused about what's what. And so what I need to do next is I need to actually update is on ground. So let's make a new function for that. We'll say private void update is on ground. And let's go ahead and make sure we call that. We can call it the very beginning of the update function because we may want to make our jump based on whether or not the player is on the ground, and so it makes sense to call this first. So we'll go ahead and call update is on ground at the start of our update function. And this thing so in this function, what we want to use is something called OverlapCollider. And if we were to look at that, we can just search Unity OverlapCollider. And this is what's going to allow us to check if our circle collider is overlapping anything that our contact filter understands as ground. Alright, and you can see that it needs a contact filter, which we've got that ready to go. But it also needs an array of Collider2Ds to store the results of anything that we're actually overlapping. So let's go ahead and create that array in our script so we have somewhere to store that data. I'll put it up here. We'll say private Collider2D array. And we can name this thing ground hit detection results. Something like that. That is what it is, so it's a decent name. And the next question is, we know we want to call OverlapCollider, but it needs to be called from an instance of a Collider2D. And so we want to call it from the circle collider trigger that we made from this thing. So we need a reference to this circle collider in our script. So why don't we go ahead and set that up with the serialize field. I'll put it right here. So we'll say serialize field private circle collider2D. Actually, let's just call it collider2D and be a little more abstract in case we ever want to use a different shape later. And we can call this thing ground detect collider. Oops. Or actually, maybe a better name would even be to refer to it as a trigger so that it's clear that this is a trigger. So we can call this ground detect trigger. Alright. And so once we've made that, we can go back to the editor and make sure we initialize it. So over here in our player character script, we should now have a ground detect trigger slot, and we're going to drag our circle collider that we marked as a trigger into that new slot that we created. So now if we go back to Visual Studio, anytime we refer to this ground detect trigger, we know it's going to be looking at this particular circle collider that we made. Okay, so in our update is on ground function, we want to say ground detect trigger dot overlap collider, and this will get a list of all the colliders that our ground detect trigger is overlapping with. And so we need to pass into it a contact filter, which we have ready to go. That's our ground contact filter. And we need to pass into it an array of Collider2D that we can store the results in. So this will be a list of all the stuff that we're overlapping with. And so we can use our ground hit detection results for that. Although there's one more step I overlooked earlier. We need to make sure we initialize this array, and so we need to initialize it with something large enough to store a decent number of results in case there are multiple colliders that we're overlapping with. So we'll say it equals a new Collider2D array of length 16. That should be good enough. So we can fit up to 16 different colliders that counted as ground inside of this array. But really, we're not even going to use this. It's kind of just a formality. If it may be down the road, we care about the specifics of what this ground detect trigger is touching. But for our purposes right now, we're going to say that if there's anything that counted as ground, we want to just simply set our isOnGround equal to true. So if you look at this function OverlapCollider, it's actually returning an int. So it's returning a number based on the number of things that counted as ground that our ground detect trigger is overlapping with. So if that number is greater than 0, that means we're touching some kind of ground. So what we will do inside of this function is say isOnGround equals if this number is greater than 0. Alright, so at this point, what we might want to do is add a quick login to print to the console whether or not we're on the ground. And that way we can just double check this is actually working the way we expect. So we can say debug.log, and we'll say is on ground and we will print out the value of is on ground. And then we can save the game or save the script, go back to Unity, and let's go ahead and run and see what our console output looks like. So I can see right here at the bottom it's showing me the last printout. You might need to uncheck collapse to get this to work the way we want for this test. And so as long as I'm on the ground, I expect this one at the bottom to say true. And if I jump, I would expect it to start saying false. So it looks like it's working. The next test, we're detecting ground okay, but the problem is I can still jump over and over and over. So the next step will be to go back into our code and actually use this Boolean to just determine whether or not we can jump. So I'm going to comment out this print because we don't need that happening every frame. And let's go into our handle jump input. And what's happening here is we're checking if they press the button. And if they're pressing the button, we jump. Well, we need to actually check two conditions. Condition 1, they're pressing the button. Condition 2, we're actually on the ground. So we'll add to this and is on ground. So if is on ground is true, this will be true. If is on ground is false, this whole thing will not ever happen and will not jump. So we have to both press the button and be on the ground, and then we will jump. So let's save and give that a shot in the editor. So we'll run the game, and it appears to be working. So that'll be the end of this video. I think the next step here will be to kind of get our movement working a little bit more um, responsively to make it feel better. It still feels a little off to me. Um, so that'll be the next step.